Little hard to see me over all these swords. So I run a sword daycare here, and I happen to have several Albions visiting at this point, including one of my own. And I thought this would be a good chance to answer the question, are Albions worth it? I'll skip, for anyone who doesn't want to stick around and listen to me talk, I'll skip to the end. Yes, they are worth the price tag. So Albion has made a name for themselves in the sword industry as kind of a gold standard for high-end swords, at least from a production standpoint. Obviously, you can spend more on a sword if you want to go to a custom smith who's going to bring your own specific vision for what a sword is to life. But when you're working with swords that are individual models and that are coming off the line, especially for European makers, they have an incredible selection in their catalog, and you are paying a hefty chunk. In many cases, you're going to be spending more than $1,000 and waiting in excess of 2 years from when you place your order, if you're ordering from them directly, in order to get your Albion. So the question is, given that we have so many other makers out there who are now making good swords, is it worth it? Are they worth their hype to pick up an Albion sword instead of a high-end windlass or a Beller Arms or a dark sword, armory sword? What makes them stand out? What is distinct about Albion swords? So I've had the opportunity to handle many Albion swords over the years, and they definitely do have their own characteristics. And in this case, Albion has several different lines of swords. I'm mostly going to be talking about their next generation line. They also have, for instance, the museum line. They have the squire line. So they have a couple of different lines. But the next generation in particular, and the museum to an extent, these are swords that were designed with the expertise of famed swordsmith, famed bladesmith Peter Johnson. So first and foremost, before anything else, you have the attention to detail of someone who spent time, effort, energy, in some cases years of expertise going into museums, personal collections, and getting the information, data, taking detailed measurements and drawings in order to faithfully recreate actual swords from surviving antiques. Now, when he creates a sword for the next generation line in particular, he is not recreating a sword one-to-one from an existing original. So for instance, this one here is the Albion Oakshot, and it's based very closely on a sword in the Wallace collection, but it is not perfectly recreating that specific sword. The museum line basically does that, as best I can understand. So those are much closer to based on actual examples in museums. But for the next generation, instead, he will look at a sword like this, Gadjalt, and say, of the dozens or maybe hundreds of swords that Peter Johnson has studied from that time period or of that type, he will use his knowledge in order to create a design that will fit right in line with any of the swords in that group and would be representative of that sword, so that you could say, oh yeah, I want a sword from that time period, and that would be, you know, a perfect representative of that group of a type 10A or what have you. And he'll do that, and it won't stand out from the crowd per se. That is not an easy task at all. So collecting that data, synthesizing it, and then producing a design that's faithful to all the original sword designs. So that is incredibly valuable, and not very many people are able to do it. So to me, that's one of the most important things. Along with that comes the attention that you'll find in the blade. So you can see already just from an aesthetic standpoint how beautiful these blades are, how lovely the finish is on it, how crisp the fullering is on all of it. But something that a lot of other makers miss is how the dynamic properties of the blades are produced. And a big one on that, for example, is distal taper. So I'm going to pick on windlass because I've owned many windlass swords over the years. And if we take a windlass sword or a cold steel sword, it's very common for those swords to have minimal or linear distal taper. So for instance, if I were to pick a sword that had linear distal taper, it might start at, let's say, 5 millimeters of thickness at this end, and taper down to 3 millimeters of thickness at that end. And it's just going to evenly taper like a nice steady wedge all the way to that point, and then have almost no taper until the very end. What you find on historic examples and the originals that the designers have based these swords on is that swords in period had complex distal taper. So a sword like this may start off thick and then taper very quickly in the beginning of the blade, and then only taper very shallow amount for the remainder of the blade, and then just taper a little bit at the end. Another sword may have very even taper throughout most of the blade and then taper quite a bit in the foible. You may have some swords that taper uniformly and then have a very quick taper towards the end. In the case of the C-axe up here, it actually is very slightly thinner here at the shoulders and then gets thicker in the middle and then tapers again towards the tip. All of these are unique to the individual sword, and depending on what type of a profile it has, depending on the intent, how much meat it has to be able to thrust, what type of fullering it has, all of that will factor into what type of taper it has and will tremendously affect the mass distribution and the handling properties of the sword. The other big thing when it comes to handling is the handle, shall we say. So the grips on these Albion swords are really, really lovely, and you can feel it in your hand, how each time that you hold one, the leather cord wrap is really top-notch, and I don't really think that there's anyone else who's doing it as good as this. You'll at times hear a sword that'll come out, and it'll have a really, really good grip, and they'll say, wow, this grip, this is as good as, and they'll try and compare it to Albion. And the reason for that is because Albion is setting a standard for how well these grips are done. So it's very distinct, it's very comfortable, and while each model will have a kind of different configuration, they're very consistent. You don't ever have to worry about it coming off. They're easy in the hand. The type of leather and the coloring on it is very durable and doesn't seem to come apart. But the other thing that I'd really like to point out is also the finish that's on all of these fittings. I've handled, again, by this point, hundreds and hundreds of swords, and the fittings will oftentimes, come into contact. They interface with your hand in certain ways depending on what type of fencing you're doing, what type of sword you're working with. But the way that the fittings are produced in Albion, the type of finish that they have applied to them is really very, very nice. So not only do they look good, but they also feel good in the hand. So that when you come in contact with them, if you're fencing without a glove on, and your hand is bumping up against them, not only is it chamfered, because there's plenty of other makers who have chamfered grips, you don't have to worry about ever bumping up against something, catching yourself on a ledge. And to be honest, it's just very comfortable to touch. Like, I feel like I could just snap this pommel off and just carry it in my hand and hold it and manipulate it all day. I've met other swords where I will just even take a little glance against the pommel or against the cross, and I'm really concerned that, that's going to be a hot spot, that's going to rub up against me, and it's just going to hurt me for the rest of the day. And that's basically never happened with any type of an Albion sword. A point to discuss is the edge. So Albion does put a very small secondary bevel as for the final sharpening. So if you're coming from a background where you're used to Japanese blades, maybe you'll poo-poo that, thinking that it's not going to be as sharp as you'd like it. It does come typically with a nicely sharpened apex. So if I take a second and get a piece of paper, editing pause, and we're back. And while I'm about to perform this, I'm going to take a slight detour and interrupt my point about edges and just talk about customer service. So this particular sword is actually just back from Albion, and I wanted to thank Mike, who works in customer service, because he's a complete joy to deal with. So Albion really does care about their customers. They seem to be very easy to communicate with, And I really want to thank them for being very easy to work with and to help resolve issues as they come up, and really being interested in making sure that their swords are as good as possible and represent them and the designs as they really are supposed to be. And so knowing that this has just come back, here we can test the edge. So coming straight from the factory, there we go. All right, it does cut, but it took a second for us to get there. So the sharpness is in the second half of the blade. So that's kind of funny. So that little aside indicated that while sharp, they aren't necessarily the sharpest swords that are on the market. Many people who pick up Albions do later additional sharpening in order to bring them very, hair-popping sharp. In my experience, they work fine because, again, the dynamics on them often outperform other swords of their category, and because they are still quite sharp, like I wouldn't want to run my hand along their blade level of sharp. For light targets in particular, they work perfectly well without any additional sharpening. But again, depending on your intended use case, that's up to you, and that will vary. So, in the end, I think that collectively there is very little room for improvement. They've been in the game for quite a while. Their lineup is spectacular. They have a wonderful selection on a variety of swords, and if you're looking for medieval swords that are produced at a high degree of fidelity to originals, and you have the available capital to go for them, you're not going to be disappointed if you see a model that you like. This is just a very small selection of what they have available. If you're interested in looking at even more Albions, and especially how they compare to other swords, obviously I do a limited amount of sword review on this channel, but some of my good compatriots do even more sword review. So in addition to the real big sword tubers, make sure you check out my buddies. Check out Alien Tude, who's quickly making a name for himself as the top guy at sword reviewing. Check out Matthew Jensen, who is good at showing off a sword's performance and hopefully not breaking them every time. Check out Kane Shen, who is doing, even right now, a overview on medieval swords. And check out the Unsheathed Sword Reviewer guys, Vic and John. They cover Albions and all sorts of different types of swords in between. So between all of them, you should be able to get a great idea of if there's an Albion and if it's right for you. In my opinion, if you like one and you want to pick one up, you're going to be very, very pleasantly surprised. Let's get a close-up look at these. Come, bring the camera in. Oh wait, I don't have a cameraman. I'll